Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor S.J. Tambiah, one of the leading experts in the world on Southeast Asia, to our series. Tambiah, how did you first come to be an anthropologist, if you accept being an anthropologist?
It's a somewhat long story. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Ceylon, an American sociologist called Bryce Ryan arrived and to set up the first department of sociology and anthropology at the university. And like many others of my generation, I would have gone on to read history or English literature or something of that sort. And his appearance really caught the attention and enthusiasm of a lot of us who entered the university at that stage, because he initiated, for instance, field work. He would take students into the field during vacations, during weekends, and this was a new experience to us, because, as you well know, both in India and Sri Lanka, as elsewhere in the British colonies and ex-colonies, I at least went to what we would call a British type public school, St. Thomas's College in Colombo, a sort of colonial version of an English public school, where I learned more English history than Ceylon history. In fact, I knew very little Ceylon history, where I learned Latin rather than my own mother tongue, and where the entire education was oriented to the West rather than giving us a grounding in our own society and culture and traditions and so on. And you could say that I was one of a type which sort of rather deracinated, if I may use the word, that didn't know our own past and didn't know what to make of our lives, except to become lawyers or civil servants or something of that sort. And Bryce Ryan, this American, took us as undergraduates to, as I said, into the field. For the first time we were visiting villages. We were brought up in the city and went to, as I said, English type public schools. And we were turned on. So in fact I went on to read economics with sociology and anthropology as we call sort of special subject. And thereafter, after I finished my BA, I was recruited as an assistant lecturer at the University of Ceylon, and I went abroad for further studies. And there too I had to make a critical choice. The normal thing was for if you wanted a PhD to come to SOAS or Cambridge or Oxford, whichever university would accept you for, to read history or something. Usually SOAS, I would imagine. And Bryce Ryan persuaded me that I should go to America for my graduate studies. And I went to Cornell and was trained in sociology primarily, with anthropology and social psychology as secondary subjects of concentration. But I had a good dose of both sociology and anthropology there. And then I went back. So that's how I became, what shall I say, a sociologist, anthropologist.
Yes. When you were in America, or when you later worked, there must have been a number of people who influenced you theoretically. Were there any outstanding influences in your work?
See, at the time I went to America, the foremost sociologists were people like Tyler Parsons and Robert Merton. And among the anthropologists, there weren't any prominent people. There were a large number, but at Cornell I worked with sociologists like Robin Williams, who had been trained by Parsons and Merton and came out of the Harvard School of Sociology. And I worked with Maurice Opler and good gracious, other people, including Lauriston Sharp. Now there at the time, all of us are put through large doses of Max Weber, Durkheim, Pareto, and even certain amount of Marx, because these were the great thinkers, and this Parsons had dealt with at least three of them in his big work. And I began to read a lot of anthropology, but rather eclectically. It could be from sort of Margaret Mead and that sort, Clarkon, to British social anthropology, Brackett, Brown, Malinowski. So your question is what intellectual?
Yes, was there any particular individual, any anthropologist, who either intellectually or personally, as an individual, influenced your work?
So in fact, when I went back to Sri Lanka, it's with this kind of rather broad-based, wide-ranging introduction, so to say, to sociology and anthropology. And there I started doing field work. It was in the course of doing field work I began to, for the first time, study sort of kinship in the villages around Kandy. And out of that work come set essays like that were published in JRAI and Man, like the studies of kinship in Papa Dummara, study of polyandry, Kinship Fact and Fiction essay, which won the Quayle Prize, and so on. And it was at that time that I met Edmund Leach, who had come to Sri Lanka to do Bulgaria. And Nur Yalman, I met, who was doing work in Telepahe. So it is, I'm trying to give some idea of how I then shifted over to being a full-time anthropologist, so to say, because I became convinced that unless one went and lived a long time and did the kind of participant observation, the kind of field work as anthropology did, I would never get a deep understanding of the social institutions and traditions of the people. Especially because, although I was a native of Ceylon, born as a Ceylonese, I had very little idea of what villagers were doing and so on. Then from Sri Lanka I went to Thailand.
Why did you choose Thailand?
Now that again, I think the story is rather complicated. Let me give it at sort of two levels. One story would say that was a sort of fortuitous set of circumstances, accidental circumstances. When I was in the United States studying at Cornell, I met an Australian called Hugh Philp, who was an educationist, psychologist, social psychologist from Sydney. And we both then attended, we were one of the first, we belonged to one of the first batches of what we call Smith-Munn scholars, the forerunners of Fulbright scholars. And we both went to the same orientation course, or whatever it is, held at Bennington College. At that time, the United States was starting this foreign scholars program, and they didn't know how much English people knew who came from the other side of the world, And we were put into the same orientation course, and there we met and made good friends. And he took his PhD at Harvard. and I would visit him frequently, and that's how I began to meet many of the Harvard anthropologists and sociologists as well. But he went back to Sydney to become a lecturer in education there. And he was invited around 58 or 59 to be the first director of a UNESCO Government of Thailand research unit to be established in Thailand, principally to formulate a plan for the implementation of a primary and secondary school program throughout the country. And he went as director of this research center, and out of the blue wrote to me and said, "Won't you come and be the anthropologist for the research center? You know, I have to send a lot of people out into the villages to find out the state of the schooling system, what kind of things they learned, and I need an anthropologist to also gather video information about village life and so on. And will you come and help me?" And my task was to go as a research anthropologist to train Thai students in fieldwork and also in formal education. They were students, candidates for an MA in education or something like that. So I had to teach them sociology and anthropology as one part of their education, and also train them in fieldwork. And that's how I went, because I had been back in Ceylon for 5 years after my PhD in the States, and I was ready to, in a sense, try something new. So at one level, invitation and so on, and that's sort of accidental and fortuitous. Now, why did I then agree to leave Sri Lanka? And that is much more motivated, in the sense that when I went back, I was very keen to do field work, but very poor funding. And another friend of mine, Gananath Vesekara, who is now a well-known anthropologist at Princeton now, he and I decided to start field work in a remote jungle village in central highlands of Sri Lanka. And I remember we went around asking for money, and the Asia Foundation gave us 500 rupees. That's what started us off. And so he and I were taking some students with us, try to do this research on a shoestring. It's out of that work that our first sort of writings began. But we were poorly supported, and there wasn't even the University of Ceylon no tradition of supporting social science research, and poor backup and institutional facilities and so on. Secondly, and I'm not sure I can speak about this with any sense of objectivity, but it's certainly something at that time, and even now, sort of strong in my consciousness, which is that in 1956 in Sri Lanka we had what has been called later a political and cultural revolution. It may be too strong a word, but S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike was elected Prime Minister, and he and his party swept aside what was called the United National Party, who were labelled as the takeovers from the British colonial government, collaborators in sort of under the shield Galahad language of the first lot of Ceylonese, educated English-speaking Ceylonese, to whom the British transferred power and so on, who were in their own way broadly national and secularist, but very elitist, and by and large didn't speak to the interests of the nation as a whole, or to the majority of the rural population. But Bandaranaike came to power on the wave of what has been called Buddhist singular nationalism. It's rivalist Buddhist, but Buddhism, which said that religion and state and society in Sri Lanka are one, and the charter for this, the old historical chronicles, Mahavamsa and Chulavamsa and so on, and Buddhism, which had been very strong, it was declared in the old society and was supported by state, had gone under in British times. And British times, the Christian missionaries were given special privileges, and Christian schools were started, and it was time to revive and give a place to Buddhism and make it even a sort of state religion. But the Buddhist revivalism, in a sense, combined with Sinhalese an ethnic identity, so that together with the royal Buddhism was the interest of the majority group of Sinhalese, and it was a nationalism, therefore, that spoke to the two dimensions of which the most important were Buddhism and Sinhalese ethnic identity. Now, I am a Tamil by birth, and I'm not a Buddhist either. My family is, in terms of the later British times, and what you will call sort of English-educated elite. My father was a lawyer, and we all my brothers and uncles and so on are either lawyers or doctors or something of that sort, you see. And I had been educated in Colombo in one of these public schools where, at the time when I grew up, things like race, religion were not divisive factors. I went to school with Sinhalese boys, Tamil boys, what you call burghers, like the Anglo-Indians in India, and so on. And my teachers belonged to all different communities, including English teachers. And for the first time, in '56, when I had gone back to Sri Lanka, my PhD, and was beginning to teach there in my 20s, I was confronted with this great political upheaval, which also, in some sense, was challenged my own identity. And there were some curious currents. On the one hand, it seemed to me that I absolutely had to understand and come to terms with what Buddhism and society and polity and so on in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia was, because that was the primary identity of the country, and that was what was, was part of the whole political and historical consciousness, something from which I was alienated, both by virtue of my education and the fact that I belonged also to a minority community. At the same time that I couldn't, with any comfort, remain in Sri Lanka to understand this and be detached, because I was too much a part of the scene. And in a sense, the invitation to go to Thailand gave me the opening to, in a sense, study in a deep way what it is to belong to Southeast Asia and be part of Buddhist civilization and all that sort of thing, and understand the people at a level that I have not previously understood, and study these without being myself a part of the immediate political and historical process as I would have been in Sri Lanka, so that I could have a certain detachment, distance, come to terms. So I think I have not spoken about this before. This is a very important aspect of the motivation and what gives me drive and orientation to do the kind of work I have done in Thailand. At least most of my books are very much concerned with, religion and politics and Buddhism and society and this. And I think, in a sense, that's the way I was finding out for myself. What is it that I belong to in Asia?
So you were stepping back from yourself and looking at your position in Sri Lanka from the Thai perspective.
Yes.
Could I ask you then just one question on the Thai work? What was your first impression when you went to Thailand? I mean, did you get a sense of culture shock and otherness? What struck you most about Thailand?
It's at one level it was recognizable because it's very Buddhist and in that sense, at that sort of, if you go to Thailand, Bangkok, all those temples and monks walking around, all the villages, Buddhism is a primary concern at that level, and it was not unfamiliar. And the Thai people themselves, you see, knowing that I came from Sri Lanka, automatically included me as a Buddhist. I was for them. Sri Lanka means Buddhist. And in Thailand, it's, as you know, it's part of their tradition that Sukhothai and early classical polities in Thailand got their Buddhism from Sri Lanka. The pure Buddhism came from Polonnaruwa and so on. And in that sense, I was from Southeast Asia, an Indian, but from Sri Lanka was, in some sense, one of them by virtue of belonging to a Buddhist civilization. Now, but on the other hand, there are so many things that are different. I mean, the Thai people look different, language was completely different, and their political system, sort of ruling generals and even kingship and all that was entirely a sort of different phenomenon to study and understand. Research unit which I joined, in this UNESCO Government of Thailand institute. It's called actually the Bangkok Institute for China Study, but the activity is so much broader than the label conveys. And I took Thai students from the teachers' college where the research institute was located, and we went to. We worked in 3 rural areas. We first started in a set of villages just southeast of Bangkok. Then the following year, this is between the years 1960 and 63, we went to northeast Thailand, which is the location of my first monograph. And then the year after, we went to North Thailand. Now, these are 3 different regions within Thailand. The regional differences are largely related to dialectal differences, but also some historical differences. Northeast Thailand had its own, was part of the Thai Lao political entities, connection with Luang Prabang and the Laotian polities, and northern Thailand has its own language and brand of variant of Buddhism, which is much closer to the Buddhist kind. And Central Plain Thailand is very much a part of 19th century developments under the Chakra dynasty. So, when one not only to me, but to the very Thais that I took with me, who were Bangkokans, these were strange places, in some way strange places, because they had to come to terms with village rural life. They too were sort of city folk, and with dialect differences, and even though they were Buddhists, there are different ceremonies which we attended in the temple and so on. So for them too, they had to learn a great deal. So together we started, learning all this. To me, as I said, because although I came from a what would be now described as a primarily Buddhist country, I had no background in Buddhism, nor did I have a good understanding of village life and so on. So that doing fieldwork in Thailand, although I had done a little bit of fieldwork in Sri Lanka as well, was for me entirely sort of new learning experience. It opened up new expanses to investigate and study. And I was in Thailand, beginning to see that I had to work on kinship and local social organization and Buddhism and economy and politics and so on, and the necessity to see how they interrelate was for me becoming a very real issue. That's why I keep talking about sort of totalizing perspective, or that what interests me is a sort of social formation analysis and so on. Is something that is grounded in a sort of research and intellectual experience in Thailand. So a lot of the things I started to work on and write about were in that sense new. My first book, Buddhism and the Spirit Cults in Northeast Thailand, is really looking at the way Buddhism and so-called spirit cults relate to each other and form a single field. How these Buddhism and spirit cults, on the one hand, weave into the sort of everyday life, so that you can explain this as well. What Edmund Leach called a practical religion. That there's a book of essays edited. At the same time that these Buddhism and so on, you have to know something of the classical past, because it comes from a past. So that I put together that book in a way which I think was, I won't say novel or new, but it was a resolution of certain problems in a slightly different way from the other studies that were extant at the time. One was, of course, Spiro, with whom I have a great theoretical argument for some years. So Buddhism and the spirit cults in Burma as two religions, two opposed religions that are somehow fighting with one another, and it also, at a psychological level, split the Burmese individual to two egos and two selves. And I didn't see it that way. The people seem to be, for them it's sort of a single field of activity, and they will pass from one to the other without any of these contradictions or tensions. And the other was the sort of Redfield Singer Marriott tradition of great tradition, little tradition. We had Sanskritic Hinduism, or in this case classical canonical Buddhism, and there's village cults, and that framework also was highly unsatisfactory. And although Louis Dumont had in his book on the Kala, Dumont Pocock, had tried to come to terms with the same thing in their own way, they hadn't produced a solution either as to how to talk of the past and the present, history and anthropology, classical Buddhism and local cults, in a way which seem to, on the one hand, represent what I believe the actors to experience as a single field with internal distinctions, at the same time, in terms of this theoretical problems, a better answer, a more satisfactory answer than they had given. So I think that I would like to place that book with those problems in mind, and I try to arrive at a particular solution. Subsequently, I've done much more work in Thailand than I've written about, especially in the villages there. I have heaps of stuff on kinship and family and life tenure and village organization. which I keep saying I shall come back to someday. Especially, I think I can contribute something to the theory of bilateral kinship systems and how they operate in Thai context. But I haven't produced anything to which I can refer to. Do you want me to talk about the other?
Yes,
book?
well-renowned sir.
Yes. Well, and the first book had already, therefore, in a sense, while posing for me the problem of how to represent at the local sort of village level religion and society and economy in some kind of as a totality. I realized that I was getting a picture in the first book only from sort of the very bottom upwards, but I knew that if I want to have a sort of engage in a macro discussion of Buddhism and polity, which is part after all the historical chronicle tradition and which all the previous historians also, within Sri Lanka or Burma have talked of. I couldn't grapple with this unless I went to the capital itself, And so my next leap was to talk about Buddhism and polity and society at a macro civilizational level. That means, the Sangha and its differentiated the sects, kingship as a particular institution, and polity. Then, if I went to Bangkok, I would see the larger pattern in these terms, which I could then relate to once again to a lot of the historical materials. So that was my second problem. Well Conquered, Well Renounced is an attempt to grapple with many problems. I think in these works, I am trying to deal with issues that arise out of a meeting or conjunction or in Indology, anthropology, and history. I think Well Conquered and Well Renounced try to do two things. One is that I very seriously disagree with what, in a deprecatory way, I say sort of polytech society Buddhism, though that is a term which damns too many people who, but it's a convenient label. We used to say that early Buddhism is only what is to be found in certain doctrinal texts, and especially those doctrinal texts which are important to the monastic life or to the salvation quest. And that is what is the core part of Buddhism, and everything else is therefore, watering down, or it becomes a world religion and gets adapted or incorporated into society, and things happen. Whereas, to me, early Buddhism, I don't mean the earliest Buddhism, about which people know very little, but by the time of Ashoka and all that in India, there must have been Buddhism, a Buddhism which had become a larger phenomenon, not only confined to the monks and the bhikkhus, but also it had made a certain kind of relationship with kingship and society. And unless one put together a picture of early Buddhism in terms of its religious and political and sort of social interrelations as sort of larger totality, a package, one couldn't understand how it became so-called world religion in Weber's terms, and how it could have traveled so successively all the way south to Sri Lanka and Burma, Thailand, and then there's a northern trajectory of a different sort. But Buddhism, the core of Buddhism of a doctrinal kind, which some people thought was the essence, couldn't deliver the answer to my wanting to understand what is the nature of Southeast Asian societies, the polities, which seemed all the time to refer back to certain kinds of historical traditions. So the problem of continuities and transformations is a very important one for me to try and tackle. And in Thailand, the World Conquer and Renaissance, I think, starts with some kind of larger statement of what I take to be early Buddhism in both its religious and political and social aspects. And then in Thailand, during the 19th century and the present century, especially after the Stanley Chapter dynasty, where the kingship and religion and polity are intact in a way that's unknown in any other Southeast Asian country today. As you know, in Burma went under to the British, and there was no more traditional kingship, and Sri Lanka the same way. But Thailand still had these larger institutions in place. No doubt historically they had transformed, changed, but the package was there, and that it was, for me, to relate this present to the past and somehow talk about continuities and transformations, and was important. And that's what I try to deal with in that book, I think. And that's several things that come out of it.
Could you finally, on Thailand, presume you're still working on Thai material? Could you say something about your current work?
Yes, there's been a sequel to World Conquer and Renaissance, which has just gone to press. Cambridge will bring it out in next spring. It's called Buddhist Saints of the Forest and the Cult of Amulets. And it's really a study of Buddhist concepts of sainthood and charisma, study of sectarianism, Buddhist traditions of hagiography, and even millennial Buddhism. Well, that's a lot, but I'll let me tell you in a simpler way what it's about. What triggered that study off is that when I was in Thailand in 71, 73, and then again in 79, 80, I had gone to work in Bangkok once again, and I was very interested in concepts of power and authority, kinds of persons in that society who were thought to have this power and charisma, and what their careers were, and what kind of followings they had, and so on, and in the course of this study, I was studying lots of new cults and monasteries and movements in Bangkok. I was fascinated by the amulets. Recently in Thailand, a number of forest monks out in the peripheries of Thai society, in the northeast and northern parts of Thailand, so socially and territorially on the periphery, certain forest monks. Now these old, in the Buddhist Sangha has a forest monk tradition and a village and city monk tradition. And these certain number of forest monks were really truly in the periphery of society, were being acclaimed as saints, Buddhist saints. And this was a rather very interesting phenomenon. And they had, the way they had been acclaimed as saints on the basis of their lonely wandering on the peripheries of Thailand, Laos, Burma, Cambodia, and so on, and presumably subjecting themselves to feats of asceticism and engaged in meditation of the classical type. But at the grassroots level, their reputation grew. Once they were claimed as saints and founded their hermitages and had local pupils and local followings, they were immediately their charisma was thought to be appropriated by all the powers in the center, from royalty to the ruling generals, to the civil servants, and the banks and merchant houses, and so on. And they would form processions now from the capital to the periphery and try to put with the charisma. And the cult of amulets then becomes the way in which the connection, the dialectic takes place, because the lay sponsors mint these amulets and take it to these holy men, the saints, and they bless them. And in blessing them, they are thought to confer on them, transmit to them their metta, their loving kindness, and their virtues and character and so on. So these objects become, they are really objectification of the charisma of the saint, and are thought to radiate powers which have influence on the worldly activity. So once again, the interesting dialectic between sort of saint and worldly rulers and worldly people, and the way in which then this is the truly the world-renowned the saint who had, by virtue of his ascetic tactics and contemplation, withdrawn from the world, come to experience that kind of charisma, how that is turned back on the world and becomes life-affirming once the laymen get hold of it, you see. And so the cult of amulets excited my attention, and I saw all over in Bangkok in the bazaars these new amulets blessed by these saints, and there's a tremendous grab for them. And all the Bangkok people, especially the intelligence and intellectuals, all wear these amulets around their neck and so on. So I thought I'll investigate this further, and that's what the book is about, because I try to follow the careers of these so-called saints, and these saints are the subject of popular hagiography. And so I analyze these hagiographies as popular literature, and what is their literary mode, which takes me once again back to earlier models of biographies of the Buddha and earlier saints. So there's a previous model, which is followed in this hagiography. And then I try to do something else. I see these successful hagiographies as, if you want to analyze them, one not only has to talk of the life of the saint, but also the career of the biographer. And that, unlike in previous sort of historical documents, one can do here when it's contemporary writing. So I analyze one important masterpiece, Life of a Saint, a present-day saint, and also his biographer. And I can then locate this work not only in relation to earlier hagiographical traditions, but what this book has been written for in the present religious political context, what use is made of it, And that takes me into modern sort of sectarian politics and the use made of this, and the biographer himself and his propagandist intentions and so on. And takes me straight into Buddhism and politics again. That is one. And then I think I try to deal with the cult of amulets, and ultimate theoretical interest of this would be that I not only get into thinking about Weber's notions of charisma, but the whole problem of fetishism of objects, both Morse, Gift, and Marx, fetishism of commodities, and I try to contribute something to the theory of that.
Well, fortunately, there are going to be many productive years of writing Tambiah ahead of you, so we'll be able to have another interview in another 20 years. But could I just finally ask you came back to Cambridge and were very active in the department here, and worked with the great figures, Edmund Leach, Chakravarti, Fortis. Is there anything you'd like to say about any of those three as influences on your life?
Yes, all three have influenced me. Edmund Leach the most. Because it's he who I met in Sri Lanka, and whose work stimulated me, and he was responsible for bringing me really from Thailand here. He read my essays on polyandry and Canadian kinship, and so I came here as a Smuts visiting fellow to this university, and I think, and Cambridge anthropology theoretically is, as you well know, Mayer's work, which belongs to what, some structural functionalist tradition, and Edmund was partly that, and then partly coming to terms with structuralism. And his coming to terms with structuralism was also the time I was here, and that influenced me a great deal.